You have your Bibles with you now. Turn to James 2, and I want to read verses 8 through 13. Let's begin with verse 8. James chapter 2, beginning with verse 8. If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbors yourself, you're doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not commit murder. If you do not commit adultery, but you commit murder, you become a lawbreaker. Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And that's the statement you notice I've put on the whiteboard, because we're going to emphasize that this morning. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And I wonder why this statement was necessary. Because when you look at the word triumph, mercy triumphs over judgment. It's actually talking about mercy being superior and winning the battle over judgment, because it is full of confidence based on what God has done, and it has no fear of judgment. It indicates that there's a battle going on. Like, oh, okay, so you mean there's a battle between mercy and judgment? Well, there's always that inbuilt tension between policy and person. That's a crucial thing to recognize. And I can't tell you how many times that's what we deal with in my daily setting when I'm working with people. Here's the policy, but here's the people. I've worked with people in the past, and Nancy knows these stories. I don't have time. Working with people that are all about dotting the I and crossing the T and don't care about people. And I'm telling you, those are the worst kind of people to work with. And I don't want them around me. I'm just telling you. There's no compassion. There's no heart. If you don't measure up, they want you out. Oh, okay. There's a difference between doing right things and doing them 100% right, that's all you care about, as opposed to being a right person who cares for priorities. I remember one person said this, well, let's not get stuck on the policy, because after all, we're the one who made them in the first place. We're the policy makers. Why are we letting policy dictate to us what to do? And those of you who have worked in work settings, really policy is supposed to be like guidelines, with the understanding that when priorities come first, people come first, you may have to, on occasion, lay aside a policy. And it's not the end of the world. Okay? So we're going to talk about that. The core of Jesus' teachings and living out his own ministry was an example of this. And of course, what got him in trouble. I want you, if you have your Bible with you, I want you to look at two places where Jesus says this very thing. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Turn your Bible to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9. Well, let's see, how much of it do I want to read? Well, let's start with chapter 9, verse 9, because this paragraph is Jesus calling Matthew to come and follow him. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the IRS, or well, tax collector booth. But that's me, he's the IRS guy, okay? Follow me. He told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. And while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. Now, my Bible has in quotation marks sinners. I'm glad that it does, because it's being told from the perspective of how people viewed those that were with the tax collectors and came to eat. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciple, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, here's what Jesus said. And I put in parentheses in my Bible, my thing, and this is what got him into trouble. You ready? It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And to be consistent, the NIV should have put quotation marks around the word righteous. The Pharisees thought they were righteous. They didn't need anything in it. But Jesus says, I want you to go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, not judgment, which is what they were all about. Now turn 3 chapters over in Matthew 12. And again, Jesus gets himself into trouble. Let's start with verse 1, Matthew 12. At that time, Jesus went to the grain fields on the Sabbath day. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said, "Look, your disciples are doing that which is unlawful on the Sabbath." Well, Jesus didn't leave it there. He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priest. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day, and yet they're innocent?" And I'm not really sure exactly what he's referring to. Apparently, I tell you that one is greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire sacrifice or mercy and no sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And going on from that place, he went into their synagogue. A man with a shriveled hand was there, looking for a reason, and they were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" And he said, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And so he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out and was completely restored and just sound and healthy as the other hand. And the Pharisees rejoiced. No, that's not what it says. You listen to what it said. You would think that's what they would have said. No. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. All because he healed somebody's hand on the Sabbath. And you look at that, you've got to be kidding. Really? That's the way you think? Well, I love it when Jesus says, go and learn what this means. I think at the very foundation of this concept of mercy triumphing over judgment is not an easy thing to learn and live by. If we're not careful, the human tendency is always judgment. Well, you didn't measure up. You didn't do this. You went and did that. It's so easy to judge, isn't it? The Good Samaritan story illustrates that. We all know the Good Samaritan story. There are other stories in the gospel. Matthew 9:27, where there are two blind men, they say, "Have mercy on us, Jesus, Son of David." Matthew 15:22, a woman from Canaan has a demon-possessed daughter, and she comes to Jesus. Jesus, have mercy on me and my daughter. They knew that somehow Jesus' teachings, and it's interesting to me too, because the people in the crowd that interacted with Jesus, they probably didn't have a lot of time with him, but they were hearing what got repeated. He is a person who has a heart of compassion. And if you've got somebody sick or dying or you need something, the word is out. He responds. Okay? So she knew where to come. So this is our statement that's going to guide our lesson this morning. Mercy triumphs over judgment. And in this paragraph, in the book of James, chapter 2, 18 through or 8 through 13, there are some principles that come out that I want us to highlight so that when we leave here this morning, and this thought crossed my mind. In the book of James, there are such powerful statements that I kind of thought, as I'm going through James and studying it, I need to start drawing me up these 3x5 cards and writing some of these verses on here, and I need to keep going through them every day. I need this one. Do you all need this one? Mercy triumphs over judgment. Mercy triumphs over judgment first because of who Jesus is. Go back to Jesus. Jesus embodied mercy. Jesus was God's offering of mercy. John 3:16. God so loved the world that he what? He gave his one and only Son, his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Mercy and compassion were the twin tools of Jesus' ministry. Jesus faced religious leaders who didn't have one ounce of mercy. And it's quite extraordinary and unbelievable, as we've seen. It stirred up so much controversy with the Jewish leaders every time he did something out of compassion and mercy, and it didn't meet their criteria, and they thought he was breaking some rule. It got so bad, we just read, they were out to kill him. What is there? Here's a question that made me raise. What is there about established religion that does not easily grant mercy? We need to hear that. I think there are a lot of people who quit on church because this is what they don't feel. We'll talk in a moment the parameters of that. Doesn't mean everything's acceptable. We'll talk about that. But a lot of people don't see this, and they don't feel it, and they don't see it enacted, and so they quit on church. Mercy is not the acceptance of sin. In fact, Jesus forgave the adulterous woman in John's Gospel. And remember the woman at the well, and he told her to go and sin no more. To go and sin no more. So mercy is needed where there is sin. It's not that mercy is absent where there's sin. The more sin there is, the more mercy you need. I mean, that's what Paul says in Romans 6. Jesus offers mercy to those who feel that they're not worthy of such forgiveness and acceptance. Turn to Luke 15. And y'all know this story. Luke 15. And there's one or two verses I want to highlight. This is the story that we call the prodigal son. My Bible says the parable of the lost son. I grew up hearing or seeing the parable of the prodigal son. Well, I didn't know what prodigal meant. And we actually have one song in our handbook that talks about the prodigal son. And I remember as a teenager, it's time for me just to quit singing the word and hearing it. I want to know what it means. So I opened up the dictionary. What does prodigal mean? Wasteful and extravagant. The prodigal son. What did he do? Well, when he got in the far country, he wasted everything the father gave him his inheritance, didn't he? Okay? So this parable of the lost son, I want you to look at verse 21 especially. When the son comes back and the father receives him, remember what he does? Puts a ring on his finger, gives him a coat, gives him sandals. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. There was one German writer years ago in talking about this parable. He said, we call it the wrong thing. It should not be called the parable of the prodigal son. It should be called the parable of the loving father. Because the son comes back and he knows he's not worthy. And he even says that. And here's what's interesting. Have you noticed in that story, some people point this out, that what he actually says to the father is not quite as long as what he rehearses to himself. And it's almost like the father then, when the son gets the first part of what he wants to say out, he's got it spoken out. The father just grabs him. No, stop. Don't rehearse the whole thing. No. The father said to the servant, quick, bring the best robe. And so in the parable of the prodigal son, the loving father, he felt unworthy, unacceptable, but look at what the father does. Everything he can express and extend as mercy and forgiveness. And here's what's interesting. Do you realize, and I'm going to say this, do you realize that's not the end of the story? That the end of the parable of the prodigal son is where it's dealing with judgment triumphing over mercy. You know how I know that? You know that too. The older brother. The older brother is an example of this turned around. It's judgment triumphing over mercy. Listen to this. While the older son was in the field and he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. I'm thinking, think of what it must have sounded like when they're celebrating. So he called one of his servants and asked him, what's going on? Here's what he heard. Your brother has come, and your father's killed the fat calf because he has him back safe and sound. Can you imagine, and as a parent and grandparent, when your child or grandchild is back and they're safe and sound? Oh, great sigh of relief. The older brother became angry and he refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him, but he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and I've never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, notice he doesn't say my brother, the son of yours, when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you killed the fatted calf for him. I want you to listen to what the father said. My son, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate, and we had to be glad, because this brother of yours, it's not my son, he turned it around. This brother of yours, he reminded your brother, this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost, and he is found. That's why mercy triumphs over judgment. The father knew that. The older brother, he didn't have a clue. He was just resentful. He didn't care. Mercy triumphs over judgment because that's the royal law of love. That's what James calls it. When I think of Jesus, he is the divine royal figure who demonstrates what love can look like. And when we think of law, we think of that which is unyielding, demands exacting obedience. In fact, probably for all of us, if I take the word love and I take the word law, my mind has a hard time putting those two together. Love and law. Do they go together? Well, guess what James says? He uses a wonderful expression. The royal law of love. Do you realize? I don't think that expression is like that anywhere else in the New Testament. And I know the Jews really didn't think of it in this term. Here, James emphatically declares it's the royal law of love. And this makes us aware that even from Old Testament time to now, that any law of God has always been issued from his divine heart of love. And it's because he deeply cares about us. I will speak a moment to this because I said this earlier. What's been called progressive, permissive Christianity always operates under the false assumption that any guidelines or parameters that can be attributed to God means you're talking about an unloving God. That's not the way the New Testament presents it. So what is this royal law? James is clear. Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, that sounds like the second commandment, doesn't it? First, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And what? Your neighbor as yourself. That's the royal law of love. And it actually comes from Leviticus 19:18. Of all places, can you imagine? By, yeah, this morning in Sunday school, we had a couple of quotes from Leviticus. Leviticus is not all about boring stipulations of what the priests have to do. Because if you've ever tried to read through Leviticus, you can drop off to sleep pretty quick. It's all this boring stuff. But there are key places in Leviticus that are interesting. He quotes here from Leviticus 19:18, and listen to the whole quote. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. That's the royal law of love. And then he ends, I am the Lord. So this royal law of love is rooted in the very character and being of God. And practically, what did it mean for Israel? You don't seek revenge. You don't bear a grudge against anyone. Really? Mm-hmm. That's a practical application of it. Notice how specific the royal law is. It's about how we treat other people. So it's rooted in the very being of God. And in this last part of James chapter 2, this particular verse, he says, when you do this, you are doing right. It's interesting how many times in the book of James, and I went in one of my other older Bibles, I did this, underline all the times it talks about do and doing. It's filled all over the book of James. James perceives faith as your belief system in action. So, whenever you love your neighbor as yourself, and it's as practical as not seeking revenge against people, not bearing a grudge against them, you are doing right. What is that? Faith is action. Here, faith is doing right when it takes into account the practical application of the royal law. Number 3, mercy triumphs over judgment when favoritism is rejected. And remember last week we had that whole paragraph. And it's interesting because it's almost like James like, that was so important. I can't quite leave it alone. I got to go back and make one more comment. And he does. Look at the comment. Turn back to James 2. Look at the comment that he makes. This is verse 9. If you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. Now, he's going to, because of the way he words this, I think there's something going on here. Because he's going to mention, you know, it's wrong to commit adultery and murder. And even though, let's say you haven't committed adultery, but you commit murder, well, you still broke the law. And I think the reason he set this up is because there are people involved in this sin of favoritism that may be saying something like, well, James, really, this is not that bad. You know, you're stepping on toes where you just need to forget. It's not that bad. And James is like, wait a minute, it is a sin. And I want you to quit thinking that if you break one law, well, this one's not as bad as that. Okay. I mean, you could see why he'd do it. Well, I'm not as bad as that other person. This one's not as bad as that one, so I'm still kind of good. No. Yeah, he said, that's not the way you're thinking. You cannot pick and choose which commandments to follow and which ones to break. That's not an option. What he wants his readers to conclude something like this. Even though you've not murdered or committed adultery, you're guilty of favoritism, and that in the eyes of the royal law, you're a lawbreaker. You're just as bad off as anybody else. Mercy triumphs over judgment because it comes from a life of consistency. Did you catch this? James says, speak and act. Both of those together. Speak and act. There's a consistency of what we say and how we behave. We will be judged, but notice the kind of judgment that he's talking about. He's not talking about a judgment that is unyielding, unforgiving, and that sort of thing, but rather it's the law that gives freedom. Now let's talk about the way he uses the word law here. It almost sounds like a couple times the way Paul uses the word law. It's not in the sense of like law on the books, but it's almost can be translated, understood in the idea of it's a grounded principle. I'll give you a great example. In physics, they talk about the law of gravity. Okay, it's a principle. It's a foundational principle. You cannot ignore gravity. What happens if you ignore gravity? Well, a lot of times you get real trouble quickly. And so, as a basic law, a foundational principle, there is the principle of the law of gravity. It's the same thing here. It's the principle, and so what is that grounded principle? It's his main point, running like a golden thread through this entire section that we read. Mercy triumphs over judgment. That's a foundational, grounded principle for the Christian. We have to operate off of that every single day. James even says that this grounded principle, when enacted and lived faithfully, guess what? It offers freedom. Now let's think about that. I tried to use my gray cells on that. Can you imagine what you don't have to worry about when you just free yourself up from judging? It's not a place to judge. We don't have to burden. Now, when I was a younger preacher, this was my burden. I thought it was up to me to figure out who was faithful and who wasn't. And I'm telling you, that's a burden you don't want to bear. It's not up to you, not up to me. When you take yourself out of the judging business, your heart can become so light and so free. It's amazing. And we need to hear this. It brings freedom, he says. It sounds like that James has just read Matthew 11:28-30. Here's what Jesus says. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Let's turn that around. If you live a life where judgment is triumphing over mercy all the time, I can guarantee you're going to be living with a heavy heart. I can guarantee you that. Okay? So Jesus is saying, come to me. My burden is light. My yoke is easy. Why? Because this is one of the principles that Jesus lived by. He embodied it, and he wants his disciples to live by. Number 5, mercy triumphs over judgment. Boy, we need to hear this. Is because judgment has a boomerang effect. It doesn't. Listen to what he says. Because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who's not been merciful. Did we hear that? So what we dish out is going to come back. Whoa. I think it was several years down my Christian life before I understood that. And you're like, oh boy, I need to be careful. Okay? Jesus highlights this in one of his parables. Oh, we're running out of time. You know this in Matthew 18. It's called the parable of the unmerciful servant. That servant was forgiven a whole lot, found more of his fellow servants that just owed him a few pennies in the pocket, so to speak. Threw it in prison. And you're like, what? And Jesus says that if you're going to treat people like that, guess what? God's going to treat you like that. Whoa. Whoa. It's a real strong statement. And you know what started that whole thing? Peter comes up to Jesus and said, Jesus, how many times should I forgive my brother? So he's ticking off the number of times he's forgiven somebody. I got my limit. Well, and we may We may have said that to somebody in the past. I got my liver, I have back, I'm gonna forgive you. Well, mercy that triumphs over judgment, and this is what Jesus said, mercy that triumphs over judgment doesn't keep count. Ooh, really? You mean I can't keep, no, you don't keep count. It's not your business. Oh, so we've learned today that mercy triumphs over judgment because of who Jesus is. It triumphs over judgment because of the royal law of love. It triumphs over judgment when favoritism is rejected. And it triumphs over judgment because from that comes a life of consistency. Speak and act this way. Mercy triumphs over judgment because judgment has a boomerang. And we know that. So what are some practical parting words for our personal application? So in order for us to embrace and practice this wise life principle that James is really hammering home here, mercy triumphing over judgment, I want to end with, it's kind of funny, sometimes I'm the oldest of 6 kids, okay? I'm the oldest sibling. And sometimes one of my sisters or brothers will say, okay, this is Sunday morning, how's everybody doing? And I'll say, well, doing fine. Here's what I'm preaching on. And sometimes they give me feedback, sometimes they don't. But I said, I'm preaching this morning on mercy triumphs over judgment. And my brother that's a year younger than I am, he said, here's what has helped me with that. And it's been very, very helpful. So he sent it as a text message, and Nancy wrote it down for me because it's on my phone, so I couldn't access it. So, but I'm going to read it to you. Listen to this. Sometimes being understanding is more important than being right. Sometimes we need not a brilliant mind that speaks, but a patient heart that listens. Not keen eyes that always see faults, but open arms that accept. Not a finger that points out our mistakes, but gentle hands that lead. That's powerful. That is powerful stuff. And that's exactly what we're talking about. We get to know Jesus as our example. We love our neighbors ourselves. We reject any notion of practice or favoritism. We speak and act without hypocrisy. We all know we're imperfect and make mistakes. And we don't want any aspect of harsh judgment boomeranging back on ourselves. That's almost like self-protection. Okay, I'm self-aware here. Oh, man. So are we ready to come to God in Jesus because our hearts need forgiveness and power for living out this mercy that triumphs over judgment? Let's embrace in our life this gift of wisdom that enables us to live it. And may God grant us the wisdom to take this principle seriously. I mean, it's amazing how much time and space, and James is a small letter. He devotes a whole section on this. I'm always amazed at what James chooses to emphasize in his short letter. And this is one of them. And it's a life principle for every Christian. And it needs to be put on a 3x5 card and put on our mirror so we see it every morning. Because I guarantee you we're going to be challenged in different ways. Mercy, kindness, or judgment.